A frantic knock shatters the silence of the night. When the man opens the door, he finds a drenched, trembling boy clutching a torn stuffed animal. "Please," the boy whispers through tears. "He's coming." Moments later, the man's call to 911 uncovers a chilling secret that turns his quiet life into a race against time. What was the boy running from, and why does the danger feel closer than ever? Before we dive into this gripping story, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Rain pelted against the windows in relentless sheets, the sound a steady drumbeat in the quiet, dimly lit house. John sat slouched in his armchair, the flickering light of the television casting shadows across his unshaven face. A mug of coffee, long gone cold, rested on the small table beside him, untouched for hours. The silence in the room felt heavy, oppressive even, as if it were trying to smother him under the weight of his own thoughts. The knock came suddenly, sharp and frantic, echoing through the stillness like a gunshot. John flinched, his heart skipping a beat as he instinctively turned toward the door. It wasn't the kind of knock that suggested politeness or patience. It was desperate, erratic, almost pleading. He hesitated, his gaze darting to the clock on the wall. 11:37 p.m. Who could possibly be out there at this hour, especially in weather like this? Another knock, louder this time. His stomach tightened, a strange mix of apprehension and curiosity tugging at him. Rising slowly, he moved toward the door, his bare feet making no sound against the worn wooden floor. As he approached, a muffled sound reached his ears, sobs, faint but unmistakable. He froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Sobs? His mind raced. Was someone hurt, in trouble, or was this some kind of trick? Swallowing his unease, he unlocked the door and pulled it open. What he saw made him freeze. Standing in the doorway was a little boy, no older than 6 or 7, his small frame trembling as rain drenched him to the bone. His hair clung to his face, his cheeks streaked with tears and mud. In one hand, he clutched a stuffed toy so tightly it seemed like a lifeline, the other hand pressed against his chest, as if he were holding himself together. "Help me," the boy choked out, his voice barely a whisper, lost amid the roar of the storm. John's breath caught. For a moment, all he could do was stare, trying to make sense of the scene before him. The boy looked so fragile, so terrified, like he might crumble under the weight of whatever nightmare had brought him to this door. His lips were turning blue, his tiny body shivering violently. Snapping out of his stupor, John stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. "Get in here," he urged, his voice gruff but urgent. The boy hesitated, his wide, fearful eyes darting behind him, scanning the darkness as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. "It's okay," John said, softer this time. "You're safe. Just come inside." The boy took a hesitant step forward, then another, before finally crossing the threshold. John shut the door behind him, locking it with a firm click. He turned to the boy, who stood dripping on the floor, his head bowed as if he were trying to make himself invisible. "What happened to you?" John asked, his voice steady but edged with concern. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he looked up, his gaze locking onto John's with an intensity that made the older man's chest tighten. "They're coming," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "Who's coming?" John crouched down, his tone softening even more as he tried to meet the boy's eye. "Hey, look at me. Who's coming?" The boy opened his mouth as if to answer, but instead swayed on his feet. John lunged forward just in time to catch him as his small body crumpled. His skin was icy to the touch, his breathing shallow and uneven. Hey, stay with me," John said, panic creeping into his voice. He carried the boy to the couch, grabbing the nearest blanket and wrapping it around him. The boy's eyes fluttered open briefly, his lips moving soundlessly before he managed to rasp, "Don't let him take me." "Who?" John pressed, but the boy's head lolled to the side as he slipped into unconsciousness. John's heart pounded as he stared at the child. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a lost kid or a runaway. This was something darker, something dangerous. And whoever he was, John had a feeling he wasn't far behind. John's hands trembled as he adjusted the blanket around the boy's frail body. The words, "Don't let him take me," echoed in his head, sending a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. He sat back on the edge of the couch, staring at the boy's pale face, trying to piece together what he should do next. The flickering light of the television painted the room in shadows, making everything feel surreal. He reached for his phone on the coffee table, but the memory of the boy's terrified plea stopped him. "No police," the boy had said, his voice cracking with fear. John hesitated, his thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Every instinct told him to get help, to let someone more qualified handle this. But something in the boy's eyes, wide, desperate, haunted, made him pause. This wasn't just fear of being in trouble, this was something worse. The sound of wind howling outside snapped him out of his thoughts. He looked toward the window, suddenly hyper-aware of the vulnerability of his home. The flimsy locks on the doors, the large bay window in the living room. Anyone determined enough could break in with ease. The boy had said someone was coming, and John couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He got up, his movements quick and deliberate, and began locking the windows, pulling curtains shut, and flipping off lights one by one. Darkness filled the room, but John didn't care. It felt safer this way, hidden. He returned to the couch and knelt beside the boy. "Hey, kid," he said, shaking his shoulder gently. "Can you hear me? I need you to wake up." The boy stirred, his eyelids fluttering open briefly before closing again. He was too weak to respond. John cursed under his breath, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He grabbed the first aid kit from under the kitchen sink, the old metal box rattling as he carried it back to the living room. Years of disuse had left some of the items outdated, but he found bandages and antiseptic that would do for now. Pulling back the blanket, he inspected the boy's arm. There was a deep gash, crusted with blood and dirt, running from his wrist to his elbow. The edges were jagged as if made by something sharp but imprecise. A knife, perhaps. "What happened to you?" John murmured under his breath as he cleaned the wound. The boy winced in his sleep, his lips parting in a soft whimper. John worked quickly, his hands steady despite the chaos in his mind. He wrapped the bandage snugly around the arm, tucking the end in place before pulling the blanket back over the boy. A loud bang outside made him freeze. His head snapped toward the door, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't thunder. This was different, sharper, closer. Someone was out there. He moved to the window and peeked through the curtain, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. The rain made it hard to see, but a faint glow of headlights in the distance caught his attention. A car was parked down the road, its engine off but its lights cutting through the storm. John squinted, trying to make out the figure he thought he saw inside, but the rain obscured everything. His mind raced. Who was in the car? Could it be the person the boy was running from? And if it was, what would they do if they found him here? John stepped back from the window, his pulse hammering in his ears. He couldn't sit and wait. He had to act. He glanced at the boy on the couch, his fragile chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Whoever was out there, they weren't going to take him. Not on John's watch. Grabbing an old baseball bat from the corner of the room, John positioned himself near the door, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. He listened intently, the silence between the crashes of thunder almost unbearable. Another knock, sharp and deliberate, shattered the quiet. John's grip tightened on the bat. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm but low. No answer. Only the sound of rain pounding against the porch. "Answer me!" John shouted, his nerves fraying. Still nothing. But then, faintly, came the sound of footsteps retreating into the storm. He stayed frozen by the door, waiting, his heart pounding in his chest. When several minutes passed without another sound, he finally exhaled, his shoulders sagging with relief. But the relief was short-lived. Whoever was out there wasn't gone for good. They were waiting, watching. John returned to the boy's side and sat down heavily in the armchair. He ran a hand over his face, his mind a storm of questions and fears. This wasn't random. The boy hadn't just stumbled upon his house by chance. Someone wanted him, and they weren't going to stop until they got him. As John sat there in the dark, the boy stirred again, his small hand clutching at the blanket. "They're still out there," he murmured, his voice so faint John had to lean in to hear. "I know," John whispered, his jaw tightening, "but they're not getting in." The night stretched on, every sound amplified by the tense silence inside the house. John kept his eyes on the boy, watching for any sign of worsening condition. The pale rise and fall of his chest reassured him, but the nagging sense of vulnerability in the room persisted. He didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but he knew he couldn't afford to wait around and find out. The boy stirred again, his face scrunching up as though trapped in a nightmare. Then he spoke, his voice weak and slurred, the words barely coherent. Don't let him. He's bad. So bad." His hand twitched, clutching at the edge of the blanket as if trying to hold on to something tangible. John leaned closer, his voice calm but insistent. "Kid, listen to me. Who's coming? Who's after you? You've got to tell me what's going on." The boy's eyes fluttered open briefly, and for a moment they locked onto John's with a clarity that sent a chill through him. "Mr. Gray," the boy whispered. "He finds everyone." "Mr. Gray?" John repeated, the name unfamiliar but ominous. "Who is he? What does he want?" The boy's eyes drifted shut again, his breathing uneven. John cursed under his breath, his frustration mounting. He needed answers, but it was clear the boy was too weak and frightened to provide them. The name Mr. Gray lingered in his mind like a dark cloud, its weight pressing down on him. He pushed himself to his feet and paced the living room, his thoughts racing. If this Mr. Gray was out there, watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike, what would his next move be? The thought of calling the police crept back into his mind, but he hesitated again. There was something off about all of this, something that made him feel like bringing in the authorities would only make things worse. The boy's fear wasn't just of being found. It was of being betrayed. John glanced out the window, parting the curtain just enough to peer into the storm. The car was still there, its headlights off now, blending into the darkness. A shadow shifted inside, barely perceptible but enough to confirm that someone was indeed waiting. The bat in John's hand felt insufficient. Whoever was out there wasn't some random thug looking for trouble. They were calculating, patient. He needed to be smarter. He turned back to the boy, whose small frame was still shivering under the blanket despite the warmth of the room. Moving quietly, John went to the closet in the hallway and rummaged through the clutter until he found a duffel bag filled with old camping gear. Inside was a flashlight, a utility knife, and a length of sturdy rope. Tools he hadn't touched in years but which now felt like necessities. He placed them on the kitchen counter, his movements deliberate, as he began to plan for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. Suddenly, a sound cut through the quiet, a faint scraping noise like metal against metal. It was coming from the back of the house. John froze, every muscle in his body tensing as his ears strained to locate the source. The scraping grew louder, more deliberate until it stopped abruptly. John crept toward the back door, the bat held tightly in his hand. He reached for the light switch but stopped himself, remembering the importance of staying hidden. Instead, he moved toward the window overlooking the backyard and peered out through a small gap in the curtain. The darkness made it hard to see, but as his eyes adjusted, he spotted movement near the tool shed at the edge of the property. A figure cloaked in shadows was hunched over the lock, fiddling with it. John's pulse quickened. Whoever they weren't trying to break into the house yet. They were searching, perhaps for evidence that the boy was here. The figure stepped back from the shed, seemingly frustrated, and looked toward the house. John ducked away from the window, his breath catching in his throat. He waited, heart pounding, until he heard the faint crunch of footsteps retreating into the yard. Peeking again, he saw the figure disappearing into the woods behind the property, swallowed by the storm. John returned to the living room, his mind racing. The boy had said Mr. Gray could find anyone. That meant whoever was out there wouldn't stop until they were inside. John crouched next to the couch and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, shaking him gently. "Kid, wake up. We've got to move," he said, his voice low but firm. The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering open with effort. "What? What's happening?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Someone's out there and they're not going to leave us alone. I need you to trust me, okay? We're getting out of here." The boy nodded weakly, his small hand reaching for John's arm as if seeking reassurance. John scooped him up, blanket and all, cradling him against his chest. The boy felt impossibly light, his weight a stark reminder of how vulnerable he was. John grabbed the duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder, then moved toward the front door. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the darkened room. He didn't know where they would go, but staying here wasn't an option anymore. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped out into the storm, the boy's grip tightening around his neck. The rain was icy and relentless, soaking them instantly. John's gaze darted toward the car down the road. It hadn't moved, but he knew better than to assume they were safe. Keeping low, he moved toward the tree line, his footsteps muffled by the mud and water. The boy whimpered softly, but John hushed him, whispering, "We're going to be okay. I promise." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The storm seemed alive, a relentless force that drowned out every sound but its own fury. The rain hammered against John's skin, each droplet stinging like a needle, as he pushed through the dense trees at the edge of his property. The boy clung to him, his face buried in John's shoulder, his breath warm but shallow against his neck. John's boots sank into the muddy ground with every step, making his progress slow and laborious. He scanned the darkness around them, his eyes straining to catch any movement. The flashlight remained off in his bag. He couldn't risk giving away their position. The weight of the boy and the duffel bag dragged at him, but adrenaline kept him moving. Behind them, the house sat eerily still, its darkened windows like hollow eyes staring into the storm. John glanced back once, his gut twisting as he caught a brief flash of light near the tool shed. Someone was still there, searching. The boy stirred slightly in his arms, his voice weak and slurred. "Where are we going?" he whispered. "Somewhere safe," John said, his tone steady despite the knot of uncertainty tightening in his chest. "Just hang on. We're almost there." In truth, John didn't know where there was. His first instinct was to get as far from the house as possible, but the reality of the situation loomed large in his mind. They were on foot, soaked to the bone, with no clear destination and no guarantee they weren't being followed. The thought gnawed at him like a persistent ache. Ahead, the trees thinned slightly, revealing a narrow gravel road that wound deeper into the woods. John stopped at the edge, crouching low and scanning the area. The road was empty, glistening under the rain, but the vulnerability of open space made him hesitate. If they were being watched, crossing it could be a fatal mistake. The boy stirred again, his small hand gripping John's jacket. "He'll find us," he murmured, his words barely audible over the storm. John's jaw tightened. "Not if I can help it," he muttered under his breath. He shifted the boy's weight in his arms and made his decision. Staying in one spot wasn't an option. He darted across the road, his boots slipping on the slick gravel, but his grip on the boy steady. Once on the other side, he ducked into the cover of the trees again, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He lowered the boy to the ground briefly, crouching beside him. The child's face was pale, his eyes half-lidded as he fought to stay awake. "You're doing great, kid," John said, brushing wet hair from the boy's forehead. "Just a little longer, okay?" The boy nodded weakly, but his expression was distant, his mind clearly elsewhere. John fished a water bottle from the duffel bag and held it to the boy's lips. "Drink," he said softly. The boy took a small sip before turning his head away. "I'm sorry," he whispered. John frowned. "What are you sorry for?" The boy didn't answer, his eyes slipping shut again. John clenched his jaw, frustration and worry battling for control. He couldn't shake the feeling that the boy knew more than he was letting on. or could remember more than his fear allowed him to share. The sound of tires crunching gravel snapped John's attention back to the road. He ducked lower, his hand instinctively moving to shield the boy. Peering through the dense branches, he saw headlights in the distance. The car from earlier was moving, slowly creeping down the road as if searching for something or someone. John's pulse quickened. They were being hunted. The car stopped, its engine idling. A figure stepped out, cloaked in a dark raincoat, the hood pulled low over their face. The figure held something, a flashlight, and began scanning the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, its movement slow and methodical. John's mind raced. He had to act fast. Scooping the boy into his arms again, he began moving deeper into the woods, keeping low and weaving between the trees to avoid the beam. Every snap of a twig underfoot made his heart leap, every rustle of leaves making him glance over his shoulder. The boy's voice, faint and trembling, broke the silence. "You can't stop him." John stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. "What did you say?" The boy opened his eyes, their glassy stare locking onto John. "You can't stop Mr. Gray," he repeated. "He always finds them." The words sent a shiver down John's spine. "Not this time," he said firmly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The sound of the flashlight beam slicing through the rain grew closer. John's grip tightened on the boy as he pressed forward, his steps careful but quick. He needed to find a way to throw off their pursuer, to buy them more time. Ahead, he spotted a large fallen tree, its roots jutting out of the ground like skeletal fingers. It was a small reprieve, but it would have to do. He ducked behind it, placing the boy down and covering him with part of the blanket. "Stay here," John whispered. "Don't make a sound." The boy's wide eyes filled with fear, but he nodded, clutching the edge of the blanket tightly. John straightened, gripping the bat in his hand. His muscles ached, and his breath came in short bursts, but he pushed the exhaustion aside. Whoever this was, they weren't taking the boy. Not tonight. John crouched low behind the massive tree, the boy hidden under the blanket a few feet behind him. His fingers tightened around the handle of the bat, the slickness of the rain making it hard to keep a firm grip. The flashlight beam moved closer, sweeping across the trees in slow arcs. Each pass brought it nearer, illuminating branches and patches of wet ground that glistened like polished stone. The figure's footsteps were deliberate, measured. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. They were hunting. The beam of light paused on a spot just a few yards away, and John held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. The rain did little to muffle the sound of the pursuers' movements, their boots squelching softly in the mud. John's mind raced. He could stay hidden and hope the figure didn't find them, but the risk felt unbearable. Every instinct screamed at him to act before the flashlight uncovered their hiding spot. He turned his head slightly, glancing at the boy. The child's wide, fearful eyes peeked out from under the blanket, silently pleading with him. John clenched his jaw and made his decision. He rose to his feet in one swift motion, the bat raised high. The figure whipped around, the flashlight beam catching John's face for a split second before John swung. The bat collided with the flashlight, shattering the glass and plunging them into near-total darkness. The figure let out a sharp grunt and stumbled back, the sound of metal clattering to the ground as the flashlight hit the dirt. John didn't hesitate. He swung again, this time aiming lower, catching the figure's side. The rain muffled the impact, but the force was enough to send the person toppling sideways into the mud. John's breathing was ragged, his pulse pounding in his ears. He loomed over the fallen figure, the bat poised for another strike. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp and cutting through the rain. The figure groaned but didn't answer. They were dressed in dark clothing, the rain-soaked fabric clinging to their frame. The hood of their jacket had fallen back, revealing short-cropped hair and a pale, angular face. It wasn't Mr. Gray, not unless Mr. Gray was younger than John had imagined, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. "I said, who are you?" John barked again, his voice rising. He pressed the end of the bat against the person's chest, pinning them to the ground. "Just stop," the figure gasped, holding up a hand defensively. Their voice was low, steady despite the situation. "I'm not here to hurt you." John narrowed his eyes. "You're stalking us through the woods in the middle of the night and you expect me to believe that? I'm trying to help." The figure coughed, spitting mud from their mouth. "Please, just listen." The words gave John pause, but only for a moment. He leaned closer, keeping the bat pressed against the figure's chest. "Help with what? Who sent you?" The figure hesitated, their breath hitching. "I work with someone who's trying to bring him down. Mr. Gray." The name hit John like a jolt of electricity. He glanced over his shoulder toward the boy, who was still huddled beneath the blanket, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. John turned back to the stranger, his grip tightening on the bat. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The figure swallowed hard. "Because if you don't, he'll find you. And if he finds you, neither of you will make it out alive." John's jaw tightened. Every instinct told him to trust no one, especially someone who had crept up on them in the dead of night. But there was something in the person's voice, a desperate sincerity that mirrored the fear he'd seen in the boy's eyes. Still, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. "Get up," John said, stepping back slightly, but keeping the bat at the ready. The figure moved slowly, their hands raised to show they weren't a threat. "Who are you?" John demanded again, his eyes narrowing. "My name's Megan," the figure said, her voice steady now despite her soaked and mud-smeared appearance. "I've been tracking Gray for months. He's got people everywhere. The boy, he's not the first and he won't be the last." Megan glanced toward the boy, her expression softening. "You don't understand what you're up against." John's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't need to understand," he said coldly. "I just need to protect him. And you can't do that alone," Megan countered, stepping forward cautiously. "Gray's men are already closing in. You think they'll stop if you keep running? He's got connections, cops, bounty hunters, people who'll do whatever it takes to get that boy back." John shook his head, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Why are you helping us?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Megan hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. "Because I used to be one of them." She met his eyes again, her expression resolute. "And I know what they'll do if they catch you." John stared at her, his mind reeling. If what she was saying was true, then the danger was even greater than he'd realized. But could he trust her? And even if he did, what would it cost him? Behind him, the boy's small voice cut through the tension. "She's telling the truth." John turned to see the boy standing shakily, his blanket slipping off his shoulders. His eyes, though filled with fear, were steady. "She's one of the good ones," he said softly. John looked back at Megan, his grip on the bat loosening slightly. "You'd better be," he muttered, "because if you're lying, I'll make sure you regret it." Megan nodded solemnly. "Fair enough," she said, "but if we're going to survive this, we need to move. Now." John glanced at the boy, then back at Megan. For the first time, he felt the stirrings of a plan taking shape, fragile and uncertain, but better than the blind running he'd been doing. Tightening his grip on the bat, he gave a curt nod. "Lead the way." Megan moved quickly, her steps precise and sure despite the rain-soaked terrain. John followed closely, the boy nestled securely in his arms, his small body still trembling from exhaustion and fear. The storm raged on around them, but Megan seemed unfazed, her focus sharp and unyielding. She led them deeper into the woods, away from the gravel road and the open spaces that could expose them to prying eyes. "Where are we going?" John asked, his voice low but urgent. He didn't like the idea of blindly following someone who, minutes ago, he'd considered a threat. But the alternative, staying put and waiting for Gray's people to find them, felt far worse. "There's a cabin," Megan replied without breaking stride. "It's off the grid. No power, no phone lines. It's not much, but it's safe, at least for now." John frowned, the weight of her words pressing heavily on him. "How do you know about this cabin?" "It was a safe house," Megan said, her voice steady but edged with something that sounded like regret. "When I worked for Gray, we used it as a staging point. He thinks it's been abandoned for years. I made sure of that." The admission didn't ease John's wariness, but it was clear Megan knew more about this fight than he did. And if the boy trusted her, however fragile that trust might be, John had little choice but to follow her lead. Still, his grip on the bat remained firm, and he kept his eyes on her every move. The woods seemed to close in around them as they walked, the dense canopy of trees swallowing what little moonlight filtered through the storm clouds. The ground grew more uneven, roots and rocks jutting up to snag at their feet. Megan slowed as the terrain became steeper, glancing back to make sure John was keeping up. "How much farther?" he asked, his breath coming in short bursts. "Not far," Megan replied. "Another 10 minutes, maybe less." The boy stirred in John's arms, his eyes fluttering open briefly. "It hurts," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. John glanced down at him, his heart tightening. "I know, kid, just hold on a little longer. We'll get you somewhere safe." The boy nodded weakly, his head resting against John's chest. His trust, so fragile and tentative, was a burden John felt acutely. He had to protect this child, no matter the cost. The sound of a branch snapping in the distance froze John in his tracks. Megan stopped too, her hand darting to her side, where a knife was strapped to her belt. She held up a hand, signaling for silence, her eyes scanning the darkness around them. For a moment, there was nothing but the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Then another sound, a low, guttural murmur, like voices carried on the wind. John's grip on the bat tightened, his muscles coiling with tension. They weren't alone. Megan motioned for him to follow her off the narrow path, leading them into a dense thicket of undergrowth. She crouched low, pulling a tarp from her bag and spreading it over a patch of ground. "Get down," she whispered, her tone leaving no room for argument. John hesitated, but the urgency in her voice spurred him into action. He knelt down, gently lowering the boy onto the tarp and covering him with the edge to keep him as dry as possible. Megan positioned herself near the edge of the thicket, her knife drawn, her eyes fixed on the direction of the noise. The voices grew louder, more distinct. There were at least 2 of them, maybe more, and they were moving closer. John's breath caught as he caught snippets of their conversation, their words chilling in their casual cruelty. "Search the woods," one voice growled. He couldn't have gotten far. "And the kid?" another asked, his tone light, almost mocking. "Gray wants him alive," the first voice replied. "But if the old man gives you trouble, you know what to do." John's blood ran cold. The boy was their target, but it was clear they wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who got in their way. He glanced at Megan, who remained impossibly still, her knife glinting faintly in the dim light. She met his eyes and mouthed a single word: "Wait." The voices grew closer still, until they seemed to be just on the other side of the thicket. John's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but he forced himself to stay still. The boy stirred beneath the tarp, and John placed a calming hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Stay quiet, buddy. Just for a little longer." The footsteps slowed, the sound of boots crunching against wet leaves halting just feet away. John held his breath, his fingers tightening around the bat. For a moment, the only sound was the relentless drumming of the rain. Then one of the voices spoke again. "Nothing here," the man said, his tone impatient. "Keep moving." The footsteps resumed, fading into the distance as the men continued their search. John exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging with relief. Megan remained on high alert, her knife still in hand, her eyes tracking their movements until the voices disappeared entirely. "They'll circle back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to move. Now." John nodded, his resolve hardening. Whatever it took, whoever they had to face, he wasn't letting them take the boy. Not now. Not ever. He hoisted the child into his arms again, his grip firm and protective, and followed Megan deeper into the woods. The cabin, their last hope for sanctuary, couldn't come soon enough. The storm refused to let up, the relentless rain and thunder amplifying the tension with every step. John's arms burned from carrying the boy, but he didn't slow down. Megan led the way, her movements quick and precise as she navigated the increasingly rugged terrain. The boy clung to John, his breathing shallow but steady, his small hands fisting the fabric of John's jacket. "Almost there," Megan said, her voice cutting through the sound of the downpour. She pointed to a shadowy outline just visible through the trees, a small, weathered cabin perched on the edge of a rocky slope. The cabin was barely more than a single-room structure, its wooden walls dark with age and streaked with moss. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time, which was precisely what they needed. Megan hurried ahead and crouched by the door, inspecting the lock. She pulled a small key from her pocket and worked it into the rusty mechanism. With a creak of protest, the door swung open. "Inside," she said urgently, motioning for John to follow. John stepped into the cabin, the warmth of dry air hitting him like a blessing. The space was sparse but functional. A single cot pushed against the wall, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a small table piled with supplies. The air smelled of damp wood and dust, but it was safe. For now. Megan shut the door behind them, sliding a heavy wooden beam into place as a makeshift lock. She moved to the windows, checking each one to ensure they were secure before drawing the tattered curtains closed. Satisfied, she turned back to John. "Put him on the cot," she said, gesturing toward the bed. John gently laid the boy down, adjusting the blanket around him. The child's face was pale, his eyelids fluttering as he fought to stay conscious. John crouched beside him, his hand brushing wet hair from the boy's forehead. "You're safe now," he said softly, though he wasn't sure how true that was. Megan moved to the table and began sorting through the supplies. She pulled out a small first aid kit and a thermos, unscrewing the lid to release the faint scent of broth. "This will help," she said, bringing the thermos to John. "Get some of this into him." John nodded and lifted the boy slightly, holding the cup to his lips. "Drink," he coaxed, his voice low and gentle. The boy sipped weakly, the warm liquid seeming to revive him a little. He opened his eyes, his gaze darting around the room before landing on John. Are they gone?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. "For now," John replied, his tone firm. "But we're not letting them near you. Not ever." The boy's lips quivered and tears welled in his eyes. "They always find me," he whispered. John's heart clenched, the weight of the boy's fear pressing down on him like a physical force. "Not this time," he said, his voice resolute. "I promise." Behind him, Megan cleared her throat. "We need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. John glanced at the boy, who had drifted off into an uneasy sleep, then stood and joined Megan at the table. She had spread out a map, its surface marked with circles and lines that crisscrossed the surrounding area. "They're going to figure out we're here eventually," she said, pointing to a section of the map near the cabin. "This place isn't as off the grid as I'd like. Gray has people everywhere, and they'll keep searching until they find us." John folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "Then what's the plan? Keep running?" "No," Megan said, shaking her head. "That's not going to work. We need to take the fight to them." John stared at her, his brows furrowing. "What are you talking about? We're trying to protect the boy, not start a war." Megan met his gaze, her expression grim. "If we don't take the initiative, Gray will keep coming. And next time he'll send more men, better prepared. If we wait, we're handing him the upper hand." John exhaled sharply, running a hand through his wet hair. "And what do you suggest? Storm his headquarters with a bat and a knife?" Megan smirked faintly, though there was no humor in her eyes. "Not exactly, but the boy said he had something Gray wants. We use that to our advantage." John's mind flashed to the boy's earlier confession. "The USB drive," he said quietly. "He said he took something." Megan nodded. "If it's what I think it is, that drive has everything Gray doesn't want anyone to see. Names, locations, operations. It could bring his entire network down." "And you're just figuring this out now," John snapped, his frustration boiling over. "We've been running blind while you knew this?" Megan's jaw tightened, her eyes hardening. "I didn't know for sure. But now that we're here, we have a chance to find out." John shook his head, his anger simmering. Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that we're outnumbered and outgunned. Megan leaned closer, her voice low and intense. That's why we use what we have to draw them out. Make them come to us. On our terms. John stared at her, his mind reeling. The plan was reckless, dangerous, and full of holes. But deep down, he knew she was right. They couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face Gray. And when they did, they needed every advantage they could get. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Megan's expression softened slightly, a flicker of respect passing across her face. "First, we find out what's on that drive, and then—" She glanced toward the boy, her gaze sharpening with determination. "We make sure Gray never gets his hands on him again." The boy stirred fitfully on the cot, his small frame shifting under the blanket as muffled whimpers escaped his lips. John sat nearby, his back against the wall, one hand gripping the bat resting across his knees. He hadn't slept, couldn't afford to. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of the storm outside set his nerves on edge. Megan, seated at the table, had the USB drive plugged into a battered laptop she'd pulled from her bag. "Anything?" John asked quietly, his voice low to avoid waking the boy. Megan's fingers moved deftly across the keyboard, her eyes locked on the screen. "It's encrypted," she muttered. "But not well. Gray's people rely on brute force, not finesse. Give me a few more minutes." John nodded, his gaze drifting back to the boy. His face, pale and bruised, was drawn with an exhaustion that no child should ever endure. Despite the faint comfort of the cabin's safety, John could see the tension in his tiny hands, clenched even in sleep. He wondered what nightmares plagued him, what horrors he'd seen that made him whisper in his dreams, "Don't let him take me." The soft click of Megan's keyboard stopped, and she sat back with a sigh. "Got it." John stood, crossing to the table in 2 quick strides. "What's on it?" Megan's expression darkened as she turned the laptop toward him. The screen displayed a series of folders, each labeled with cryptic codes. She opened one, revealing rows of names, dates, and locations. Some of the names were accompanied by photographs, their faces grim and lifeless. "It's a ledger," Megan said grimly. "A record of every transaction Gray's network has ever made. Kids, women, even entire families. Bought, sold, discarded like property." John's stomach churned as he scrolled through the list, the weight of it hitting him like a punch to the gut. All of this, he couldn't finish the thought. "It's not just trafficking," Megan continued, her voice sharp. "It's bribery, blackmail, even law enforcement on the payroll. Gray's built an empire on fear and corruption, and this drive is the blueprint." John's jaw tightened. "And the boy? Where does he fit into all this?" Megan hesitated, her fingers tapping the edge of the laptop. "Gray doesn't usually chase runaways this hard. He cuts his losses and moves on. But the boy, he's different. He must have seen something or taken something specific. Something like this drive," John said, gesturing to the laptop. "Maybe," Megan admitted, "or maybe something even more dangerous to Gray. Either way, he's a loose end Gray can't afford." John's fists clenched at the thought. The boy wasn't just a target, he was a threat to a man who thrived on control. That made him valuable in more ways than one. "If we can get this to someone who will act on it, we can take Gray down," Megan finished, her voice resolute. "But it's not that simple. The second we go public with this, Gray will know, and he'll send everything he has to stop us." John ran a hand through his hair, the enormity of the situation weighing on him. "So, what's the play?" Megan leaned forward, her eyes burning with determination. "We don't run anymore. We set the terms. We use the drive as bait to draw Gray out." John's instincts bristled at the thought of putting the boy in more danger, but he couldn't deny the logic. Gray was relentless. The only way to end this was to stop him at the source. And how do we do that? Megan reached into her bag and pulled out a small black device, a satellite phone. "We contact him." John stared at her, his disbelief clear. "You're joking." "I'm not," Megan said firmly. I know how Gray thinks. If we make him believe he can get the drive back and the boy, he'll come to us, personally. And then what? John demanded. We fight him off with a bat and a laptop? Megan's lips quirked in a faint, humorless smile. I've got more than that in my bag. John exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. You're asking me to trust you with his life, he said, nodding toward the boy. Megan's gaze softened, but her resolve didn't waver. I'm asking you to trust me to end this, she said. For him. For everyone Gray's hurt. John glanced at the sleeping child, his small face etched with lines of worry even in rest. The memory of his whispered words echoed in John's mind. They always find me. John turned back to Megan, his decision made. Let's do it. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as Megan dialed the satellite phone. John stood near the cot, the boy still asleep, his fragile frame barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. Outside, the storm had eased to a steady drizzle, the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows, the only noise. Megan's voice was calm but cold when she spoke into the phone. Gray, it's me. John stiffened at the sound of the name, his grip tightening on the bat. Megan's expression didn't change as she listened to the voice on the other end. John couldn't hear the words, but the tone was sharp, demanding. I have it, Megan said simply. And the boy. John's stomach clenched. Even though he knew this was part of the plan, hearing her say it made it feel too real, too dangerous. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on Megan, silently reminding her what was at stake. You want it back? Megan continued, her tone unwavering. Then come get it. Alone. The voice on the other end rose, agitated, but Megan cut him off. You know I don't bluff, Gray. If you want the drive and the kid, you'll meet me on my terms. She paused, letting the silence stretch, her expression unyielding. 2 hours. The abandoned quarry outside town, no backup, no tricks. You try anything and the drive goes public. You know what that means. John could see the tension in her shoulders as she waited for Gray's response. Finally, she nodded and ended the call, setting the phone down on the table with a sharp click. She exhaled, the weight of the conversation lifting just enough for her to glance at John. He'll come, she said. He has to. And what if he doesn't? John asked, his voice low but tense. He will, Megan said firmly. Gray doesn't take chances when it comes to his empire. If he thinks there's even a slim chance of getting that drive back, he'll show. John nodded, though unease twisted in his gut. And the boy? He asked, glancing at the child. You expect me to just bring him into the middle of this? Megan's expression softened. We don't have to put him in harm's way. We just need Gray to think he's part of the deal. Once he's lured in, we keep the boy out of sight. Safe. John ran a hand over his face, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. Every instinct told him to shield the boy, to run far away and never look back. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. Gray would keep hunting, and the boy would never truly be safe. All right, John said finally, his voice heavy with resolve. But if anything happens to him... It won't, Megan interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. I'll make sure of it. The boy stirred on the cot, his eyelids fluttering open. He looked up at John, his small face etched with confusion and fear. What's going on? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. John crouched beside him, his expression softening. We're going to make sure no one ever hurts you again, he said. But I need you to be brave. Can you do that for me? The boy nodded slowly, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. I'm scared, he admitted. John placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Me too, buddy. But we're in this together. You trust me? The boy hesitated, then nodded again, his grip tightening on the edge of the blanket. Megan approached, her movements careful, as if not to startle the child. She knelt down, her gaze level with his. You're very brave, she said softly. And because of you, we have a chance to stop Gray for good. The boy's brow furrowed. "He's really bad," he said. "He hurts people." Megan nodded. "Not anymore. Not if we do this right." The boy's small face hardened with determination, a strength beyond his years flickering in his eyes. "Okay," he said quietly. Megan stood, her eyes meeting John's. "We need to move," she said. "The quarry's a good distance, and we don't want to be late." John hoisted the boy into his arms once again, the bat slung over his shoulder. Megan gathered the laptop and her bag, ensuring the USB drive was secure. The storm had slowed, but the world outside was still shrouded in mist and shadow as they stepped out of the cabin and into the night. Every step toward the quarry felt heavier than the last, the weight of what they were about to face settling firmly on John's shoulders. He glanced at Megan, who walked ahead with purpose, and then at the boy, whose head rested against his chest. For their sake, for his own redemption, he had to see this through. The quarry loomed ahead, a jagged scar in the earth, its wide expanse stretching into darkness. The perfect place for a confrontation, John thought grimly. Too exposed to escape, too isolated for help. As they approached, Megan turned to John. "We set the trap here," she said, pointing to a narrow ledge overlooking the main clearing. "We control the high ground. If anything goes wrong, you grab the boy and run. Don't look back." John's jaw tightened. "And you?" "I'll make sure Gray doesn't follow," she said simply. John didn't like it, but there was no time to argue. He set the boy down and crouched beside him, his voice firm but kind. "You stay here, okay? No matter what happens, don't move until I come back for you." The boy nodded, his wide eyes filled with fear but also trust. John stood, gripping the bat tightly. He and Megan exchanged a glance, a silent promise to see this through. And then they waited. The stillness of the quarry was deafening, broken only by the faint whisper of the wind. Minutes passed like hours, tension coiling tighter with every breath. Then, faintly, the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached their ears. Gray had arrived. The headlights of Gray's vehicle pierced through the darkness, illuminating the jagged walls of the quarry and the slick, uneven ground. John crouched low behind the ledge, the boy hidden a few feet away under Megan's watchful eye. The air felt electric, heavy with anticipation. Every nerve in John's body screamed at him to act, but he forced himself to stay still, to wait. The car came to a stop in the center of the clearing, its engine rumbling like a predator's growl. The driver's door opened, and a tall man stepped out, his silhouette sharp and commanding even in the dim light. Gray. His presence exuded cold authority, the kind of power that didn't need to shout to be feared. He was dressed in a dark trench coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. But even from this distance, John could feel the weight of his gaze as it swept the quarry. The passenger door opened next, and another man emerged, broad-shouldered and armed. He carried a rifle slung casually over one shoulder, his posture relaxed but deliberate. John's grip on the bat tightened. Megan had insisted Gray would come alone, but John had known better. Men like Gray didn't play by anyone else's rules. Megan leaned close to John, her voice barely audible. "Stick to the plan." John nodded, though his instincts rebelled against the idea of waiting any longer. He glanced back at the boy who was curled up behind the rocks, his eyes wide with fear but his body motionless. John gave him a reassuring nod, even though his own confidence was hanging by a thread. Gray took a few steps forward, his polished boots crunching against the gravel. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth and calm, cutting through the night like a blade. "Megan," he called, his tone almost cordial. "It's been a while." Megan stepped out from her hiding spot, her posture straight and defiant. "Gray," she replied, her voice steady. "I have what you want." Gray chuckled softly, the sound devoid of humor. "You've always been ambitious. I didn't think you'd stoop to theft, though. That's beneath you." "I learned from the best," Megan shot back, her tone sharp. Gray's smile faded. He gestured toward the armed man beside him. "Let's not waste time. You have the drive and you have the boy. Hand them over and maybe I'll forget this little betrayal." "Funny," Megan said, crossing her arms. "I was about to offer you the same deal. Walk away, Gray, and I'll make sure the evidence on this drive doesn't destroy you." Gray's expression hardened, the subtle threat igniting a flicker of anger in his eyes. "You think you've won?" he asked, taking a step closer. "I built this empire, Megan. You think one little drive is going to bring it down? You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Neither do you," Megan said coldly. Gray's lips curved into a thin smile, his hand signaling his armed companion. The man raised his rifle, the barrel trained on Megan. "You're out of moves," Gray said. "Hand it over." John couldn't stay hidden any longer. The sight of the rifle aimed at Megan sent a surge of adrenaline through him, and he stepped out from the shadows, the bat raised. "Drop it," he barked, his voice echoing across the quarry. Gray's head snapped toward him, his smile widening with interest. "And who's this?" he asked. "The knight in muddy armor?" "Someone who's not afraid to put you down," John growled, his grip tightening on the bat. Gray laughed, the sound mocking and sharp. "Brave, stupid but brave." The man with the rifle swung his aim toward John, but before he could fire, Megan moved. In one fluid motion, she drew her knife and lunged, disarming him with a brutal efficiency that left him on the ground, clutching his bleeding hand. The rifle clattered to the gravel. Gray didn't flinch, his cold eyes now focused solely on Megan. "You always were predictable," he said, reaching inside his coat. John acted on instinct, closing the distance between them in a few quick strides. He swung the bat with all his strength, aiming for Gray's arm. The impact landed with a sickening crack, and Gray staggered, a gun tumbling from his hand to the ground. John didn't let up. He swung again, forcing Gray to stumble backward, his polished composure replaced by fury. "You don't know what you're doing!" Gray spat, his voice venomous. "You're playing a game you can't win!" Megan grabbed the rifle from the ground and leveled it at Gray, her eyes blazing. "It's over, Gray. You lost." Gray's gaze darted to the boy, still hidden in the shadows, his lips twisted into a sneer. "You think this changes anything? You think he'll ever be safe? I have people everywhere. You can't protect him forever." John stepped forward, the bat still in his hands, his voice low and filled with determination. "He doesn't need to be afraid of you anymore, and neither does anyone else." For the first time, Gray's confidence faltered. The sound of sirens in the distance reached the quarry, growing louder with each passing second. Megan's expression shifted to one of grim satisfaction. "You wanted to play games?" Megan said, her voice icy. "You just ran out of time." Gray's eyes darted between them, calculating, but he didn't move. The sirens grew deafening as flashing lights appeared on the ridge above the quarry, casting long shadows across the rocky expanse. For the first time, John saw something flicker in Gray's eyes. Fear. "This isn't over," Gray hissed, his voice low and venomous. John stepped closer, towering over the man who had caused so much pain and suffering. "Oh, it's over," he said, "and you'll answer for every single one of them." Gray glared at him, his jaw tight, but he didn't resist as the police vehicles descended into the quarry, their beams cutting through the darkness. Megan lowered the rifle, stepping back as officers swarmed the scene. Gray and his wounded companion were quickly apprehended, their empire crumbling around them. John exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment hitting him all at once. He turned back to the boy who had crept out from his hiding spot, his small face pale but filled with a tentative hope. John knelt in front of him, his voice soft. "It's over, kid. You're safe." The boy didn't speak, but the way he threw his arms around John's neck said more than words ever could. John held him tightly, the boy's trembling body pressed against his chest, and for the first time in a long time, John felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Relief. The rain had stopped by the time Gray and his accomplice were escorted into the back of a police car. The flashing red and blue lights painted the quarry walls in stark, shifting shadows. But for John, the world had narrowed to the small boy clutching his hand. The officers moved with practiced efficiency, speaking into radios and taking statements. Megan stood nearby, leaning against the rifle she'd used. her sharp eyes tracking every movement as if expecting Gray to somehow escape. John could see the tension in her shoulders, the weight of her own past colliding with the events of the night. She hadn't spoken since the police arrived. John knelt beside the boy, who was still holding his hand tightly, his small fingers digging into John's palm. "It's really over," John said, his voice soft. "They're taking him away. He can't hurt you anymore." The boy looked up at him, his wide eyes still glassy with fear. "What if he comes back?" he whispered, his voice so faint John had to lean in to hear. John shook his head firmly. "He's done," he said. "He's going to a place where he can't hurt anyone ever again." The boy seemed to relax slightly, but his grip on John's hand didn't loosen. His small shoulders sagged, and he leaned into John, burying his face against his chest. John wrapped his arms around the child, holding him close. He could feel the boy's exhaustion in the way he leaned into him, the fight finally draining out of his fragile body. Megan approached, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She crouched beside them, her expression softer than John had ever seen it. "You were brave," she said to the boy, her voice quiet and kind. "What you did tonight, it's going to save a lot of people." The boy peeked at her from where he was pressed against John. "Is it really over?" he asked, his voice trembling. Megan nodded. "It is. You're safe now." The boy looked between them, his lips trembling as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Instead, he reached out, his small hand brushing against Megan's arm in a silent gesture of gratitude. Megan smiled faintly, her fingers brushing over his briefly before she stood. She turned to John, her expression hardening slightly as she nodded toward the approaching officers. "They'll want to talk to us. You ready for that?" John stood, lifting the boy with him, who clung to his neck like a lifeline. "As long as they don't separate us," he said, his tone resolute. "They won't," Megan said firmly. "Not after what he's been through." The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached them, his notebook in hand. "You're John, right?" he asked, his gaze flicking to Megan briefly before settling on the boy. "That's right," John said, his tone guarded. "What happens now?" The officer flipped through his notes. "We'll need your statement, both of you," he said, nodding at Megan. "And the boy. We'll need to coordinate with child services to make sure he's placed somewhere safe." John's grip on the boy tightened instinctively. "He's staying with me," he said firmly. The officer raised an eyebrow. "That's not up to me," he said carefully. "But given what's happened here tonight, I'll make sure the right people hear your side of things." Megan stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You're going to do more than that," she said. "This boy has been through hell because of Gray and his people. You're going to make sure he's not just shuffled into some system where he can disappear again." The officer looked taken aback, but nodded. "I'll do what I can," he said. "For now, let's get you all checked out and somewhere warm." As the officers began to wrap up their work, John carried the boy to a nearby patrol car where a paramedic was waiting. The boy flinched slightly at the sight of the uniform, but John murmured softly, "It's okay. They're here to help." The paramedic knelt down, her voice kind as she spoke to the boy. "Hi there. I'm just going to check you out. Make sure you're okay. Is that all right?" The boy glanced at John, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, the boy extended his arm, allowing the paramedic to begin her examination. John stayed close, his presence a steady anchor. By the time they left the quarry, dawn was beginning to break, streaks of pale orange and pink bleeding into the night sky. John drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel as he glanced at the boy in the passenger seat. The child was asleep, his head resting against the window, his face finally peaceful. Megan sat in the back, her arms crossed as she stared out the window. The rifle and laptop were tucked safely in her bag, but the tension hadn't left her posture. John could tell she was already planning her next move, her mind calculating the fallout from Gray's arrest. "What now?" John asked, breaking the silence. Megan didn't look at him. Now we wait. Gray's empire isn't going to crumble overnight. But with him out of the picture and the evidence on that drive, it's only a matter of time. And the boy? John pressed, his voice low. Megan finally met his eyes in the rearview mirror. He'll need more than just safety, she said. He'll need a real home, stability, someone who can help him heal. John's grip on the wheel tightened. He knew what she was implying, and he felt the weight of it settle over him. I'll do whatever it takes, he said quietly. He's not going back into the system, not after this. Megan nodded, her expression softening. I figured you'd say that. They drove on in silence, the weight of the night still hanging over them. When they reached John's house, the boy stirred, blinking groggily as the car came to a stop. He looked around, his eyes wide with confusion. Where are we? He asked, his voice small. John turned to him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Home, he said simply. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of fear or pain. He threw his arms around John, his small body trembling with emotion. John held him tightly, his own throat tightening as he realized what he'd been given. A second chance, not just to save this boy, but to heal himself. Megan stepped out of the car, her bag slung over her shoulder. She watched them for a moment before turning to leave. Where are you going? John called after her. She glanced back, her expression unreadable. There's more work to do, she said simply. People like Gray don't stop just because one man goes down. John nodded, understanding. If you ever need help, Megan smirked faintly. I'll find you, she said, disappearing into the early morning light. John carried the boy inside, the house no longer feeling as empty as it once had. For the first time in years, he felt hope. A fragile, flickering thing, but real nonetheless. As the boy clung to him, his small hand gripping John's shirt, John made a silent vow. No one would ever hurt him again, not while he was around.